A few years ago, I came across this absolutely fascinating exchange of letters. It happened halfway between the world wars when Albert Einstein was trying to initiate some sort of public debate on behalf of this new project with the League of Nations. The project was called the International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation in Paris. It was founded in 1925. It was a precursor to like today's UNESCO. The International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation in Paris. It sounds like a very boring superhero group of like extraordinarily smart gentlemen or something. But the idea was that humanity's march to extinction might be routed if higher faculties of reason could generate enough cooperation and chasten our tribal impulses, which led us to our Great War. And so in the summer of 1932, Einstein begins pleading for a public debate with a character that he respects. And he talks about how he's seen his correspondent's awful account of human aggression, and Einstein actually feels that that kind of pessimism actually reveals this deep desire for human liberation. And so he starts telling his correspondent, how is it that these, the ways that the ruling classes control the masses via the press and the church and the schools, how is it that these devices succeed so well in rousing men to such wild enthusiasm, even to sacrifice their own lives? Well, Einstein says only one answer is possible, and it's because man has within him this lust for hatred and destruction. What can curtail that? Einstein actually suggests at one point that perhaps the only way we'll ever get beyond war is if we lay down national sovereignty and have some sort of government, right? But Einstein's ultimate question was so very simple. He said, quote, is it possible to control man's mental evolution so as to make him proof against the psychoses of hate and destructiveness? And so he sends this open letter out to Sigmund Freud. And Freud's response is absolutely fascinating. He's cheering on the physicist's optimism while lamenting our drive for collective self-destruction. So on Freud's wager, humanity enjoys repetition. It's the whole reason his clinical practice was full of patients who had every opportunity to change and yet refused. The impulse to destroy, he says, is present in animalistic prehistory, and then it's cemented into property ownership and ritualized with law and class division. And Freud then explains how attachment to an object actually requires, in a sense, bipolar affections such as love and hate, right? So in Freud's estimation, we can't get rid of one without losing the conditions for the other, and vice versa. So love and hate, or progress and destruction, are two vectors of desire or of attachment, right? Ridding society of violence would actually require that we rid ourselves of the ability to love something enough to fight for it, right? So in Freud's estimation, and Einstein starts catching on to this, right? Destruction's not a mistake of evolution. It's practically the point. Right, so while reading this fascinating exchange of letters, you should actually go, look them up. They're free and open to the public online. But you get two very different views of humanity, one very optimistic, one very pessimistic, right? Or one sort of maybe naively optimistic and one pessimistic as a condition for having any sort of optimistic chance at all, right? So while reading the exchange, I can't help but wonder whether Freud secretly hoped Einstein would prove him wrong, right? Did he see Einstein as a naive physicist out of his element with social analysis, or did Freud perhaps believe that his goal of, quote, transforming neurotic misery into common unhappiness might actually express itself in Einstein's project? At one point, Freud concludes by saying, the upshot of all these observations is that there's no likelihood of our being able to suppress humanity's aggressive tendencies. But the pessimist, of course, proved right. Freud was unfortunately right? The pessimist proved right when anti-Semitism reached a dangerous fever pitch and pressured his evacuation to England a few years later. And then 7 years after this exchange of letters, Freud was still lucid enough in the final I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks, final 2 or 3 weeks of his life, to understand the gravity of the German invasion of Poland. All right, so this is an interesting situation for us to consider. What kind of future do we want? Neither of the characters knew about the capabilities for intercontinental nuclear weapons exchange or climate collapse right around the temporal corner. Neither of them knew the destructive potential that we'd see in the later 20th century. But there's this kernel of this question of like, what kind of future do we desire, and why do we desire to have that future?